Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, MPC, for inviting me to come and speak to Bermuda today about embedding behavioral insights in designing public policy. I have a presentation to share with you, and afterwards there'll be some time to be able to ask some questions of me. Okay, so whilst the slides are coming up, just so that everybody knows that the book Nudge came out in 2008. And what it was really saying was that it was saying that people make decisions not in the way that most people think that they make them. That there are things that influence people in order for them to make decisions that sometimes in particular policymakers don't necessarily understand. And there are sometimes some small tweaks in how a decision is presented that can have dramatic changes in how people make changes. Okay, next slide. So this is 2008, and this is now 2017. Now in 2008, it was just in the White House that this was being done. In 2017, you can now see there's over 200 behavioral initiatives across the world that were being applied. And this is a map which I'm currently updating, and I can say that since 2017, that number has now doubled. That there are countries from across the world, every continent, who have behavioral insights being applied inside public policy. And they're all doing it for a very similar reason, which is that they've all realized that this is a policy tool that is required now in the modern day. And it's required by all governments in order to apply and make better policies. Next slide, please. In particular, I wanted to draw attention to one new country that has started to apply this, which is India. And India, in its 2018-19 economic survey, it actually had an entire chapter, and it was its chapter 2, on its economic survey and economic outlook, that it needed to make behavioral economics and nudge a central part of its economic strategy, which is quite something for a country to have this particular emphasis, to say that when we're going to be planning our economy in the future now, behavioral economics and behavioral insights has to be at the very center of the way that we are actually thinking about how we do policy. Next slide, please. And if we have a look at where behavioral insights is being applied, it's being applied in lots of different places from across the world in different policies. There isn't any policy area where it hasn't necessarily been applied. And here you can see all those different types of areas. So the economic, the social, tax, public administration reform, telecommunications, education, you name it, behavioral insights is being applied there. Next slide, please. So what is it about behavioral insights? What is it about behavioral insights that is really making a big wave and has happened? Well, there are three key things that I'd say. The first thing is that behavioral insights is introducing empirical evidence and empirical study into decision making. That means it has a scientific underpinning. So all of the decades of work that has happened in psychology, in social sciences, in behavioral sciences, all of these cognitive sciences, all of these different disciplines and the wealth of knowledge that they have are now being used in relation to designing policies. And I'll give you some examples of that later on. The second thing that behavioral insights is doing is that it is mainstreaming experimentation inside policymaking. It's to say that many of the issues that we deal with nowadays, we don't know the answers. And many of the policy interventions that we have, we don't really know if they're going to work or not. So what we need to do is we need to experiment and we need to test. And this is a bit more than just piloting. This is experimenting using a rigorous methodology where you have a control group, you have different interventions, and then you assess and then you understand which is the one that works or which is the one that doesn't work before you apply that policy intervention. And the last thing that it does is that it is introducing, or it has a strong emphasis on ethics, that there has to be a transparent and pro-social way of policy making throughout the entire process. And these really, for me, and there's a reference at the bottom there for you for an article that I did, are the three key things, which is why behavioral insights has now taken off so much in the last decade across the world. Next slide, please. So what are the lessons from the behavioral sciences for policy design? And as you can see here, the reason why we have this here is because of human behavior can be a mystery, that sometimes we think that we will do something or have a policy that is put into place, but people behave in a different way. Or we want businesses to make certain investments, and we set up certain strategies or certain schemes or programs, but it doesn't happen. And why is this? And this is what the lessons are from behavioral insight. So next slide, please. So the first a lesson, and this is from an article that you can see, there's a reference at the bottom. There are some key things that we can understand from the behavioral sciences. Number one, we don't like change. That people do not like change, and people would accept the default option that they are provided with. And one of the most powerful nudges available is around setting the default. A good example of this is around organ donations. That in those countries where the default for organ donations is that you are opted in, as compared to you are out unless you opt in, has dramatic implications for how the how much donors the country has. And simply by changing that default option can have a dramatic effect. One of the other areas where there's been a massive implication for this is in pensions, is employers having pensions where the employees are automatically opted in, not giving them the option for opting out. New Zealand did this back in 2007, 2008, and they had a dramatic increase in people saving and having better pension options afterwards, because they simply just changed the default. That was it. That you are opted in unless you opt out, as opposed to you are out of pensions unless you decide to opt in. So that's the first thing. And if you just click, you'll see that that is called the status quo bias. The next thing is that we hate losing more than we like winning. And that if you frame things in a certain way, you will get different outcomes. If you highlight the loss as opposed to the win, you will get very different decisions being made. A very good example of this, for instance, is how doctors often phrase the success rate of an operation. You have two ways of saying this. It's the same piece of information. Either you can say, if we do this procedure on you, you will have a 95% chance that there will be, or 90% chance that there will be no implications and no consequences. Or the other way to say it is that if you do this operation, you have a 10% chance that there might be some complications. It's the same information, but it's just how you present it can have different implications for how people decide. Another area is that we are unrealistically optimistic. And this happens a lot with people, particularly when they do things like bet and when they do the lottery tickets and things like that. But it also happens with governments. And this particularly happens when there are large infrastructure investments made inside governments and inside countries, that there is normally a huge optimism bias on what the budget will be and what the real budget is for building roads or building trains or lots of things like that. There was a good example in Scotland where they realized this. And what they did is that they figured out what their budget was. Then they automatically increased that by 50% to account for the optimism bias. Unfortunately, the cost was even higher than that, because that's what happens often in infrastructure projects or large digital or IT projects, that the costs often are way above what you initially thought. But this is another issue that is there and that is recognized in the behavioral sciences. Next slide, please. So here you'll just see the terminologies on the side. So the next thing is we overvalue evidence that comes readily to mind. This is a big issue, particularly amongst leadership and in decision making, that we often think about the closest piece of information to us when we take decisions. But it also is very much the case for things like everyday people, and they overestimate risks like dramatic events like terrorist attacks or murders, that this is going to happen very often, but they don't think very much about car accidents. But statistically speaking, they have more chance of being in a car accident than being murdered. But we don't think about that because we have this availability bias that is there. Social norming is a huge area that governments are using for trying to apply behavioral insights. One of the best examples of this was first started in the UK, was where in a letter that is provided to people to encourage them to pay their taxes on time, they did an experiment with different lines. Just one sentence was a difference. So it's the same letter that went out to all the people, and they experimented with different sentences to see what would make people pay their taxes on time. So they had things like, do you know that your taxes will go towards the benefit of society? Do you know that your taxes pay for the National Health Service, that they look after the elderly? Do you know this? Do you know? So they had lots of different things there. The one line that made the biggest difference for people was the line that said, do you know that 60% of people in your area pay their taxes on time? That had a 30% increase in tax revenue income coming in on time compared to any other line. And that was a simple example of using a social norm, that comparing people to other people made people pay their taxes on time. This experiment, by the way, has been repeated in lots of countries across the world now, and it all has the same effects, which is that it encourages people to pay their taxes on time. The other last two things that I was going to mention here that some of the behavioral sciences have taught policymakers to be aware of is firstly around simplifying and having salient information being provided to people. That's very much in relation to them making decisions, important decisions like on health insurance or other type of decisions they need to make. And the last one is status quo bias, which is that people procrastinate. They often will not do things if in any case, and if there are impediments put in front of them or barriers put in front of them, then they will not necessarily go ahead and make the action or be motivated to do it because they suffer from the status quo bias. So these are some of the key lessons that there have been from the behavioral sciences that now policymakers are becoming aware of in order for them to design better policies. Next slide, please. So is this all new for government? Well, I think the question really is, governments have been doing policy making and finding evidence and piloting and things like that. But has it really been evidence-based policy, or has it been policy-based evidence? That means we're collecting evidence that fits the policy instead of actually finding the evidence first and then basing our policy. Next slide. And there's a very good quote from another Nobel Prize winner here, which is around evidence and around whether or not the way that often evidence is found is biased or not. And the quote from Werner Heisenberg, who won the Nobel Prize in physics, was that what we observe is not nature itself, but rather nature exposed to our particular method of questioning. And I think this is the important point here, which is that many governments are beginning to find that, and also now the private sector as well, that the way that they maybe have been collecting information is not as reliable as it should be. We can even look at things like many of the election results that keep on happening in the polling methods that are used. And the fact that there are inbuilt biases to those processes, which means that on a number of occasions, the pollsters have been completely wrong on what the outcome is, because the method being used for getting that information is biased, and therefore it's flawed, and therefore it's flawed for decision making. And some of the sciences here are trying to address that with some of the lessons that we have about why people do certain things. Next slide, please. So here's a good example for you on some of the work that the Revenues and Tax body did in the United Kingdom back in 2009. And what they did is they tried to understand a bit more about people's behavior and why they do not pay their taxes on time. And if you see on the screen here, you'll see that there are lots of different categories that they found for why people do not pay their taxes. Now, the important thing here is the red line there, which is that what they found was that 4% of the people who do not pay their taxes on time were tax dodgers. So they were the deviant ones. All of the others were people who basically needed some help or needed some nudging. And if they were helped and were nudged along, they would pay their taxes on time. Now, what does this mean? This means as a policymaker and for someone who might be designing their policies, it's incredibly important to understand this, because now we know what strategy we need to have in order to design our compliance regime for tax. What we do not need is we do not need millions of tax inspectors with lots of hard paperwork to try and get the tax dodgers, because they're only 4%. What we maybe need is a better information process and maybe a helpline to help people pay their taxes on time. And that would be a better resource, a better use of resources for the government. And also it would be better for the individuals, because now we know why they are behaving the way that they're behaving. Next slide, please. This is another good example here, which is that, and something that's been looked into, which is, as you know, there are lots of, whenever you go on your website, you get a pop-up that comes up to say, do you agree to our cookie clause? And the Netherlands have been thinking quite hard about this, because if we're all honest, everybody just clicks OK, and nobody ever reads the terms and conditions. So we have to therefore ask ourselves, what's the point in having these long terms and conditions, and what's the cost of them? Well, in the Netherlands, they costed this out. They said they found that for businesses to set up having a cookie clause thing pop up on their website cost 74 million euros as a one-off. And then it cost them around 7 million euros per annum. Now, in terms of burdens for users, if they actually click OK, they calculate this in terms of time, that's about 27 million euros worth of clicking. But if people actually read the terms, that's 1.6 billion euros of cost. Now, the real question here is, what are the terms and conditions for? Because they're not for the consumers, they're not for users, because nobody reads them. And if we start to think in that way, and we start to understand, maybe we would get rid of this, and we would have another way of trying to do what the motivation for the cookie clause is, in order to have a better awareness for consumers, but also reduce costs for businesses as well. Next slide, please. So here I have a good example, and this is probably quite useful for Bermuda yourself as well, because of I know that you're often very involved with helping government come up with programs for businesses. And this was an example of how in the UK this was again, where they decided to experiment on how to provide the messaging for a entrepreneurship program that the government was running. Now, the only difference that they had was what message they gave to people out there, or to the businesses out there, in order to attract them to come and take advantage of this grant. Now, in this grant, people get a £5,000 pound cash award. They also get one-to-one support, and it is there to encourage social entrepreneurship. So they had 3 different types that went to different groups. They had, and what they were focusing on was the extrinsic, which is the external motivation messaging, and the intrinsic, which is the internal motivation messaging. So the extrinsic messaging was twofold. One was highlighting the fact that you got cash. So that was the cash reward. So it was saying to people, if your application is successful, it was highlighting the fact that you would get £5,000. The second one was highlighting the support that you would get. So saying if your application is successful, you'll get one-to-one support with an award manager. Then the third one didn't mention any of the rewards. It said that if you are successful, we will help you to make a difference and for you to achieve your goals. Now, the very interesting thing here is that everybody got the same thing in the end. The only difference was the messaging. So everybody got £5,000, everybody got the award manager support, but that was the only difference. Next slide, please. So what happened? Well, the results are quite astounding, actually, because those people who had the extrinsic reward, so they were told that there was money, there was one-to-one help, 27% of them were less actually successful in doing what they're trying to do. 20% of them after 1 year had fewer beneficiaries coming through. And those also who had the extrinsic reward messaging given to them, they were 13% less likely to benefit the minority or disadvantaged groups that their social entrepreneurship program was supposed to achieve. What is this telling us? This is telling us is that if you highlight the cash and if you highlight the one-to-one support, you attract the losers. If you highlight the goals that people want to achieve, you attract the winners. And again, now this has a profound implication for lots of different things because this is counterintuitive to what you would rationally think if you think about things from an economic perspective, because you would think that if you highlight to people the fact that they're getting cash and they're going to get lots of help, that this would encourage the right people to come forward, but it doesn't. And this again is one of those profound learnings from the behavioral insights world, which is now influencing policy to say that we need to think differently, not about how we assume people will behave if we do X, Y, and Z policy design, but how they actually behave and design policies effectively in relation to that. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, which is to say that, look, ultimately what we're seeing here is we're seeing a paradigm shift in terms of governance. We're seeing a paradigm shift in terms of governments from a command and control, prescription and permission, and living in a world of false certainty, thinking that we know it all. And we're moving more and more into a governance world of collaboration between the private and the public sector. Governance are being stronger and there being prohibition of red line issues only, and being prepared to live in a world of sure uncertainty. And when we live in a world of sure uncertainty, we need to have the right tools, and behavioral insights is one of those tools. We need to have the right tools that will help us navigate lots of the uncertainty and for us to ultimately figure out what works and what doesn't work before you actually implement any particular policies or any particular programs inside governments or even in the private sector, which is happening slowly, but more in relation to their relationship with consumers as well. Next slide, please. So that was all that I wanted to say. Hopefully that gives you a quick introduction to what behavioral insights is and where it is at the moment. So terima kasih, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Faisal. Learn a new thing now, behavioral insight. And I would like to open up to the members who would like to ask questions to pose to Mr. Faisal. Anybody has anything?
First of all, I was very impressed. This new learning as well, behavioral insight into how you ask the questions. I was just wondering, is there any, does it apply to every situation or different situation you have to think about what kind of questions should be asked? Whether it's like what you say, whether it's a negative way or a positive way. Just thinking, is there a different situation, different approach?
That's a very good question, and it's a very important question because I think that one of the three things from there, from the success of how behavioral insights has been applied, is the second one, which is around experimenting, which is that we can have these general rules of thumb about what we think was going to happen, but in different contexts, different things may or may not work. So that's why it's very important to understand the scientific underpinning and understand about how you frame the questions and things like that. But you never know until you actually test it out. And that's why experimentation has been one of the key elements of how behavioral insights is being applied, because you always have to try it out in different contexts. And this also means in different cultural contexts as well, that some things will work in some cultural contexts and some things won't work in other cultural contexts. And that's something that is that we're still finding out in the field itself. So I would say that it's something that you have to test in the context, and that's one of the key elements of behavioral insights.
So do you, sorry, Faisal, so do you then do focus group to just test it out before you go out and send out as a general survey?
So this is, so this is a very interesting thing, because of what it's also described, what it's also found is that it's questioning what is the reliability of things like focus groups. And I'll give you a very quick example of this. So I was doing some work it's come to an end now, so I guess I can probably speak about some of this. So I was doing some work with Scotland on them setting their water prices. And the interesting thing here is that the water companies, the Environmental Protection Agency, everybody runs focus groups and finds out consumer insights, is what they call it, finds out pieces of information and then bases their decisions upon that. So the water companies run focus groups. And when they run focus groups, they sit down with people for 2 hours and they talk to them about water. And when they ask them at the end of that session, they ask them, how important is it for you to have crystal clean water coming out of your taps? And how important is it in comparison, for instance, for you to have clean beaches or the environment? The environment comes about number 6 or number 7, and clean water is the most important thing that they can think of. Okay. Then the Environment Agency runs their own focus groups with a different set of consumers. And they do the same thing. They talk to people for 2 hours about the environment. And then at the end of it, they ask them, now, which one would you prefer? Is it okay for you to have grey water coming out of, say, the bath water where you don't drink from, but for you to have crystal clear water in only some of your taps? And how important is it for you to have clean rivers and clean beaches? Well, when the Environment Agency does it, environment comes out as number 1 and clean water comes out as number 6 or 7. So what this means is that focus groups are biased. And we have to recognize that when you run these focus groups, they are incredibly biased by how you frame it, how you discuss it, and what kind of ways you do it. And same thing with surveys, that depending upon how you design them, you can pretty much get radically different answers from very similar kind of things. Now, what the behavioral sciences is doing, therefore, is that it's introducing a new layer of rigorous design in how you run these things, to make sure that you don't introduce biases, you don't prime people to give the answers that you might want or you might not want. But also in the experimentation, you actually run field trials, and you do this. So for instance, with the tax letters, these taxes, so in the population, with a statistically significant sample size, you send out letters, thousands of letters to people, and then you get it back and then you evaluate. And this is called a randomized controlled trial. And you start to run these kind of things, which are different to your ordinary ways of finding out evidence and information, which are more rigorous, which then you can actually you can base better decisions upon more reliable data that is less biased. And that's what this is doing and introducing. So I think you had another question.
Yeah, David, would you like
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Dato. Faisal, very interesting presentation. I've actually seen some of the nudge theory before, because for many people from a sales and marketing background and so on, this has obviously been one of the sort of tools that's been used in terms of how you phrase and try to close your deals and what have you. So absolutely, it's a very, very interesting theory, but I've never seen it being applied to policy in government before. So this is very, very good. I think you picked up on the point that I was going to ask, which is actually about the cultural dimension here. It is very, very important here that, you actually develop, if you like, the right sort of cultural understanding. And you mentioned two very interesting things. One of them is about extrinsic and intrinsic thinking, and the whole idea of reward. It always reminds me that many, many years ago, when I was actually in a focus group, funny enough, I actually asked the focus group, and I've done it several times since, and the answer's always been the same: why do you work? And a lot of people here in Asia will look at you very, very strange. Well, I work because of money. But if you ask that same question in the UK, why do you go to the work? They'll say, because I want to actually make sure that my contribution is being valued. And that's number one. Money may be there in the top three, but it's certainly not the number one thing. So that you have things like that. And then in this chart that is actually up in front of us right now, you actually have command and control. So, if you take a look at, for example, the way that leadership and management is tackled in Asia, there needs to be some changes in that going forward in the same way that's actually taken place over the last sort of 20, 30 years in Europe. So, yeah, totally agree on the cultural one. I think, we can think about these issues, but we need to adapt them into the local market.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, David, for that. And I agree with you entirely that the cultural element is absolutely vital, and that's again why it's important to do experimentation and testing, because things we think work, and it's even in close quarters, things that people thought worked in America don't work in Ireland, and so how would they work in, I don't know, say the Middle East or Africa or Asia? And so that's where the testing has to come in. And I think that also your point about the extrinsic and intrinsic is very important. And I think this is something that probably lots of leading management schools are also beginning to say as well, which is that if we're preparing our economies for the next industrial revolution, and we are really thinking future, we have to start to understand that once people have a general amount of, and this goes back to Maslow's pyramid, but once people have a certain element of provision for their family and for their well-being, the intrinsic side becomes incredibly more and more important. And particularly when you're thinking about things around the knowledge economy, I mean, we're doing a lot of work at the moment here around kind of the post-COVID world. And what is that going to look like? And we had a very interesting speech actually the other day from an ex-army commander from the United States, whose big thing is around having a brain strategy. Mm-hmm. The point being that in the previous, I guess, industrial revolutions, is that what we were thinking about was about factories and about manufacturing and about building and things like that. And for that, there was an industrial approach to management, which was very physical. If we're thinking future, and now COVID, of course, with everything going online, and look at the way we're all interacting at the moment, means that now you have to look at the brain as a muscle, and that muscle has to be cared for. It has to be nurtured, and you have to understand it better, and you have to understand why people do certain things. And the amazing thing from a lot of the research is that people to a certain extent do things for money, but people do a lot more for non-monetary reasons. Mm-hmm. And really beginning to understand that is really important. And where the kind of, I guess, the public and private angle is to this, is that the public sector finding out more and more that things like the command and control, fines, inspections, things like that will only get you so far, and in fact are becoming less and less powerful. And they're quite expensive to run. Mm-hmm. However, if you're working in a collaborative way, and if you are actually looking at what are the real motivations, and you set the right parameters, you can get the behaviors for free. And I think that is kind of the big aha moment that has happened in many places. And I think that that's something that I know that Bermuda deals with a lot of these things with the good dialogue that you have between the private and the public sector. But this is one of those areas where, again, having a realistic understanding of why people do the things that they do, and money isn't the number one thing, is often the case. And therefore, you have to think about all the other reasons why people do and don't do things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Faisal, this is actually very interesting, especially if we could expand it to our work in Bermuda, where we are constantly trying to facilitate trade. And that means we have to have the public-private partnership. So it is just like the private sector nudging the public sector and say, hey, do something about it. You know, it's good for the country. We all will get, you know, we will be rewarded. You will get your, we will get more taxpayer to pay for it. But this is exactly what we also tell the certain government agencies, you know, why makes it so difficult for us to pay you where we have no choice, because why those taxes are mandatory, right? You know, but for the government, they just don't care. During this MCO period, you say that you cannot go to the bank, you cannot open up a bank draft because, you know, you don't want to have face-to-face. Can the government look into other form of payment, like electronic payment, for example? Oh, we have not come to that yet, you know. So the motivation is to the government officer is that the more people pay tax, the more the country will benefit, the more his job will be enrich or add value. I get what you are trying to say, but the thing is that how do we nudge the government, the public and private sector? Of course, both needs to be nudged, especially like dealing with construction permit. The faster that we get a permit to build a building, be it a factory or be it a nice complex, we know that we can create employment. From employment, we can create tax from business. The factory example, manufacturing factory will be able to employ workers to come and work, and then there will be products that we can export. There are taxes to be a revenue from there, the government can benefit. So these are the things I understood, you know, but maybe something that I will ask the Bermuda Secretariat if we could really get you to help us to think, because most of the process are just knee-jerk processes that we manage to hold on to it rather than to fall back 2 3 forward, 3 step forward, you know, 2 step forward, 3 step back. And then most of the time, when the nudge is forgotten and all that, you know, things are not institutionalized. We are back to square one again. So these are all the paradigm, the shift, the mindset that we need to change, the cultural that what David mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Andy. And I think maybe I didn't introduce this term in this particular presentation, but there's another term that you guys can probably use, which is called sludge. Now, sludge, if you like, is almost the opposite of a nudge. And one of the things that I think people like the public sector are beginning to realize and begin to understand, that yes, you can help and nudge people along the way. But if you have sludges inside there, and you mentioned trade is a classic example, which is that it may not necessarily be the tariffs. It may not necessarily be the taxes. It may not necessarily be those things, because those things may be explicit and businesses may know that. But why businesses won't make investments or won't make trade is sometimes the sludge involved, and that's the administrative sludge of the paperwork, of the burdens that they need to do. You spoke about construction permits. And those are the kind of things where sometimes you need sludge because sometimes you want friction because you don't want things to just happen all the time. So sometimes you want cooling off periods and things like that. But in other instances, you know, this is a notion actually, which I've been speaking with a couple of leading behavioral scientists as well, is that you almost want like a sludge audit to be done, to find out where are the points where it's not obvious that this is the reason why businesses aren't necessarily making investments or things like that. But the real reason is because, as you mentioned, that it's too much hassle for a business to have to deal with certain public sector procedures or offices or things like that, which is the real reason why you're not getting the growth in those particular areas. And you can see that happening from, I mean, you know, you have some very good, some very able neighbors who are very quite, I mean, they've been doing, so Singapore's been doing behavioral insights for quite some time now. And they have it kind of spread around. But, you know, why is it that people are happy to pay for slightly higher taxes if they are certain of the paperwork that follows afterwards and the burdens that they have there? And these are the kind of things that we're trying to unveil, is that it's not, you know, the old economic rational thinking assumptions are not the ones to base public policy decisions on. You have to base it on the context and on the lives of actual businesses and what they really live, and then cater towards that is, I think, the main point that this is trying to help with. And look, I'd be more than happy to assist in any way I can.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Faisal, for sharing. Any members have any questions? This is your opportunity to ask Faisal. All right. If not, then we would like to thank you, Faisal, for sharing with us. We've learned something new from you. We will continue to engage you to learn more. Sludge is actually, you know, something which the environment, the Department of Environment do not like. Yeah, so it will destroy the environment. But what we also have a moment of inertia where we need to have an inertia, like you say, it's all scientific, right? We need to keep somebody to, you know, to start moving. Once that wheel starts to move, all right, we hope that wheel doesn't stop. You know, we have got rid of the moment of inertia, and it spins on and spins on. And this is what I call institutionalizing the process. You know, don't stop if it is working well. Full stop. Yeah? All right. With that, if there's no other questions to Mr. Faisal, we thank you for your time with us. Yeah, thank you.